everybody here. Maybe I'm Nancy, and I'm the new pastor. This is like the first day of school, you know, but I think I passed, didn't I? Oh, okay, all right. Well, tonight we're going to talk about clay jars. And this, I'm going to read from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 5 through 12. And is it on the screen? Oh, okay. Right there. All right, y'all can follow along. Excuse me. That was good dinner, wasn't it? Oh, that ham was tasty, huh? Yeah. So, for we do not proclaim ourselves. We proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. For it is God who said, "Let the light shine out of darkness," who has shown in our hearts to give light to the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are persecuted, but not forsaken. We're struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are also being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life is in you. Amen? Amen. All right. Well, I'm sure you noticed we got some things over here. So this is called an amorpha. That's like the old name for it. You know what it really is? It's a clay jar, isn't it? And you know, they used these in biblical times. They had two handles, and then they had ropes, and they could tie them together with the ropes because they'd fill them with wine to ship it. Because wine was grapes, you know, grapes go bad pretty easy. So they put the grapes, you know, and they crush them down, and then they take the juice and they ferment it, and they make wine out of it, and then they would ship it everywhere. And so they would, these were, most of the time they looked like this. They were just rough clay jars, but sometimes they were like super fancy, like you'd use on Sunday or Christmas. But they made them really simple. And instead of returning them back and filling them back up at the vineyard, they would just break them apart. And today in near Rome, there's this huge mountain, and they estimate they are 53 million broken jars, just like this. Well, probably not just like this one. I think this came from a yard sale, but anyway, isn't that amazing? But just think about, this is a disposable beverage container. You know, think about that. And like the Coke bottles, whoops, there, put it on its handles. There, you sit there. All right. Do you remember, I don't know, some of you that are younger don't remember this, but you remember when all Coke bottles look like this? When you go to get a can of Coke, huh? You remember, out of the vending machine? Well, this always makes me think of Coke makes me think of Texas. A glass bottle that's shaped like this with the red and white lettering. We used to drive to Texas every summer in August, no air conditioning, and I couldn't wait until we stopped for gas. Because we'd go at the gas station, and there'd either be a big chest cooler out front, and you'd open it up and go down in there and get one out of ice, or this machine always fascinated me. It had, the Cokes were lined up on the side, and you put the right change in, and suddenly it would pop out, and you would pull it out. Do you remember those? Yeah, I never did know how those worked, but they were fascinating. But anyway, but what was important was what was inside this. The Coke was important, the bottle, not so much. So even though these are kind of making a comeback now, just think, these are our disposable beverage containers of today, aren't they? Yeah. So the bottle, although you can reuse it, is not as important as what's inside, because what's inside is what you need. You need some water, huh? But did you know when we throw these away and then they dump them in the ocean, like there's this huge thing called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and it's like miles and miles long, and it's kind of ruining our environment, kind of like that hill. Even though it's kind of cool now that there's a hill of clay jars in Rome, in the ocean, there's a whole bunch of plastic bottles. The bottle isn't as important as the inside. And isn't that kind of what Paul was telling us in the scripture that we just heard from Corinthians? He was saying that we had treasure, that the treasure was in clay jars. And it may be clear that the extraordinary power, not the wine, not the Coke, not the water, but the extraordinary power belongs to God. And it doesn't come from us. So it's like we're the clay jar, we're the Coke bottle, we're the plastic bottle, and what's on the inside is God, is Jesus. Yep. So anyway, so he said that this was a treasure. And just think, these clay jars were everywhere, just like water bottles are everywhere, just like Coke bottles and Coke cans are everywhere. So he used an everyday object, something people saw every day, to talk about God inside our hearts. And people criticized Paul. He was really smart. He was a good preacher. But people said that he was preaching for himself, not for the glory of Jesus. And he said, you got it all wrong. He said, we proclaim, his life proclaimed who Christ was. He lived his life in a way that showed other people who Jesus was. And, in our culture today, we really value things, don't we? Material possessions. We value ambition and achievement. But none of that means anything if we don't have Jesus in our heart. Because that becomes more important than what's inside of us, right? So then Paul talks about encouraging us, because it isn't easy to live life according to Jesus, is it? Because you got to give up some fun things. You got to walk the straight and narrow. You got to take care of yourself. You got to take care of your family, and sometimes that isn't easy. But Paul says, we are afflicted in every way, but we are not crushed. We're perplexed, but we are not driven to despair. We're persecuted, but we're not forsaken. We're struck down, but we're not destroyed. Now, it doesn't mean once we invite Jesus into our heart that we're going to have a wonderful life and everything's going to be smooth. Especially at church. I think especially at church. Because then you meet yourself face to face there and things get a little tough sometimes. But when we experience difficult times while we're serving God, we have an opportunity to discover and trust that God will love us no matter what. And yes, because light is brighter than darkness, life is stronger than death, and what resides in our clay jars of bodies is the glory of Jesus in our hearts. So he said, Paul said, I'm just the container. It's Jesus that's important. Don't pay any attention to me. If you live your life well, the way Jesus calls us to do, then people will see Jesus and not you. So he was saying that it's the message, it's the inside, it's the wine, it's the Coke, it's the water. It's Jesus that's inside of us. And that's our treasure. That's our treasure. So on the outside, all of us are clay jars. Or you may be a Coke bottle, or you may be a water bottle. I guess we could all choose what we wanted to be, huh? Coffee cup, would you be a Starbucks cup? Or would you be one that you could reuse? Yes, there you go. So, since I found out I was moving here from to Casper, treasures have been on my mind because I was moving all my treasures. So I've been thinking about cardboard boxes more than clay jars, because all my stuff was in boxes. But I wanted to tell you about myself, even though this clay jar isn't as important as what's inside. But each of us has a unique story, and in a unique way that God has worked through us to bring love in our hearts and bring love to other people. So, As I said a few minutes ago, our family went to Texas all the time because that's where my parents were from. And my dad had been married once before, and I have a half sister named Patty, and she's 10 years older than I am. And she lived with her mom, but she came and stayed with us in the summers. So before my sister Nola and I were born, in 1957, my parents moved to Denver. And then they finally bought a house in Englewood, Colorado on South Lincoln Street. And that house had this beautiful backyard. It was quiet, and it was green, and it was beautiful. What are they doing back there? Is that what that is? Oh my. So anyway, and I was little. I was like 4 or 5, and I used to go, and our garage was, we entered our garage through the alley. And I'd go in the backyard, and I was really little, and I would stand on the patio, and I would just look at the beautiful backyard, and I would feel the cool breeze, and I would always wait until the sun flooded the south side of the yard, and then I'd go in and eat breakfast. And I used to do that all the time, and I didn't realize until I was older that what I was doing was experiencing the peace of Christ in my heart. But to this day, I like to look out over green grass when it's cool. Yeah. So in August of 1966, my father was killed in a car accident in the mountains west of Denver. And it was awful. I mean, it was the worst time of my life. My mom went back to school. She went back to work. And I hated having to tell people that, no, I don't have a father. Yes, I had a father, but he died. And no, my mother didn't get remarried because my dad was the love of her life. And all this time we attended the United Methodist Church in Englewood, Colorado. And right after Daddy died, the church was great to us. I remember the first time I took communion. I was with my mom. I was 6. It was the same year my dad died. And she explained to me what we were going to do. And I could see the light coming from the door that it was near the front of the sanctuary. And I can remember the taste of the juice and that little wafer that we had for communion. It was very strong, and I can remember that to this day. And I couldn't say it in words as a 6-year-old, but that moment was really important to me because I remember it after all these years. So by the time I got to middle school, I didn't feel at home at church anymore because then family meant mom, dad, and the kids. Well, we were just mom and the kids. We didn't fit in anymore. So we quit going. I never stopped believing, I just stopped worshiping. And I started working as a nurse's aide because I liked helping people. And the yucky parts of being a nurse's aide didn't bother me. In fact, I thought they made great stories. So someday I'll tell you those. Not all of them. And I really enjoyed working with the clients at the nursing home, so I went to school to become a registered nurse. And then I worked at Mercy Hospital in Denver, which they tore down probably 15 years ago. And there was a chaplain there. His name was Pastor Paul, and he taught me to meet people where they were in their faith and just walk with them. Just come alongside people when they're sick or they're in need and just listen. And then Sister Catherine was one of our other pastoral care people, and we talked for a long time about patience and faith. And she said to me one day, "Have you ever thought about being a nun?" And I said, "Oh no, sister, I'm Methodist." Of course, I didn't tell her I hadn't been to church in 10 years. And so around that time, one afternoon, I was at the laundromat, and I was looking at this little newspaper, and I saw this ad for a singles group at a church in downtown Denver. And it wasn't because I had this huge religious experience in the middle of the laundromat. It's because I think I wanted a boyfriend. So I went. But God had other ideas for me. Because during that time when I was a nurse, that was the start of the AIDS epidemic. And it just did not make sense to me why young men and women were dying in a terrible death. And I would go to Mass at the hospital, but it didn't feel satisfying. So the first time I went to worship at Trinity, I felt like I was at home. And I felt like my soul was being filled. And I did meet a guy at church. And I dated him for 6 years, but he drank too much, and it wasn't a good relationship. So I worked in at St. Joe's Hospital, and I worked with patients that had had heart surgery, and I was a night shift supervisor, and then I was a charge nurse. So you couldn't get past me if it came on the floor. The doctors always said, sometimes you weren't very nice, but I knew my patients would get really good care. So there you go. Did you ever see that movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? You bet. I can be her. I can be her. So I became more and more active in church, and I started taking Bible study, and I wanted to know more. And one Sunday in November of 1994, I was in worship, and I heard this commotion, and I could see that this lady had collapsed, and I went over to help resuscitate her. And they took her to the hospital where I worked, and I followed her through her whole course of treatment. And unfortunately, on the day that she was supposed to go home, she died. And she wasn't on the floor that I worked on, but I was able to go sit with her family. And I'm sitting on the couch with them, and the sun is streaming through the solarium window, and you could see the whole front range of the Rocky Mountains, and it was beautiful. And all of a sudden, my heart was just filled with joy, and I'm like, okay, this makes no sense, because these people just lost their mother, and I'm feeling this incredible sense of joy. And then I knew that God was working through me to comfort them, and that's what God wanted me to do. God wanted me to become a pastor. And I didn't want to do it. You know, Moses, you know how Moses sees God in the burning bush, and God talks to him through the burning bush, and he's like, no, I can't do this. No, I don't want to do this. Well, that was me. That was me. I had all these excuses, and I prayed about it, and I thought about it, and I fought God about it, and Jesus wouldn't leave me alone. When I said yes, it all fell together. That going to seminary and becoming ordained, it all worked, the money, it all worked out. And then I was appointed to go to Price, Utah. Does anybody know where that is? It's in a little bitty mining town in eastern Utah. I was the first woman pastor in the 100-year history of the church. And there's some stories I'll tell you later about that. And I'm driving through the desert. There's nothing but brown, nothing but rocks. And I thought, what did I get myself into? And it was a hard church to serve. They didn't like each other very much. They were mean to each other. But by the time I left, we could all worship together. And that was a good thing. And I learned to be part of the community, that we needed to help other people, and we needed to let other people help us. And then in 2007, the church, the Methodist Church sends us where we're supposed to go. And so they sent me to Fort Collins, Colorado, which I was thrilled, because my mom and her family and my mom and my sister and her family lived an hour and a half in Denver. And so that was great. But the congregation, they were wounded. They had a pastor that they didn't fit well with. But we found healing through reaching out to other people. And we had a ministry where people stayed in our church for a week, 4 times a year. And then there was a wildfire and a flood. In 2013 was a wildfire, and 2014 was a flood, and we helped with that. We helped with that recovery. We cleaned out people's houses. We helped them get assistance afterwards. And then we took 4 medical mission trips to Cambodia. And I never thought that I would enjoy toilet paper and a flush toilet so much after going there. So anyway, many, many times I knew in my heart that it wasn't about me at all. It was about Jesus working through me to help other people. So then we raised a bunch of money right before I left Fort Collins, and we reopened our Christian preschool. And we did some building upgrades so that we could invite people in to use our building for 12-step groups and for community groups. And it was a great experience. People realized how much they had and how generous they could be. So I was really blessed to stay in Fort Collins for 12 years, because my mom had Alzheimer's the last 8 years that I was, or the 7 years that I was there, and she died last August. So from those early days of standing in the backyard and experiencing the beauty of nature, to feeling the call to help other people, to wanting to know more about the Bible and more about Jesus, I can see that none of this was possible without Christ in my heart. I would have never done any of that. I would have never left home to go to some little town in Utah where people were mean to each other, but then people were really nice to each other. So I think that, now, I've given you the sanitized version of my story, because believe you me, I've made plenty of mistakes. And the more we get to know each other, the more we can share our mistakes. And know that because even though we make mistakes, our hearts are healed because of Jesus, because Jesus died for us. Because light is brighter than darkness, life is greater than death, and we do it all because of the extraordinary power of God through Jesus Christ. Amen? All right. Miss Mary's going to come up and help me.